Good morrow, nerds. It is I. Role-playing games are a social activity. But despite this, trying to engage in social activity in a role-playing game is remarkably difficult. There are many methods and philosophies out there for how to do it, and all of them seem to conflict. So, how should you handle social interactions and persuasion in your tabletop RPGs? Well, that's what we'll be talking about. But before I miss the irony of talking about social interaction in a room all by myself, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. So, let's talk about the various methods that you can use to handle roleplay, persuasion, social interaction, call it what you want, in your tabletop RPG of choice. The first option is to not use rules at all. Some groups will do things entirely through roleplay. The player describes what their character says, and the GM describes how the NPC responds. This is far and away the most natural, and you might say the most immersive option, as there are no pauses in social interaction to interface with the rules. There are no weird outcomes, or a perfectly delivered speech results in failures, or an utterly fumbled request for something ends in success. But it's certainly not perfect. First of all, it is incredibly arbitrary, as success or failure will at the end of the day come down only to GM fiat. Second, it puts all the burden of success onto player skill and none of it onto character skill, which means that if you're socially awkward, your character has to be as well. The second option is to have the success or failure of the player's persuasion decided by a die roll. Usually this will be with some sort of persuasion skill or charisma ability, but the exact name may vary. It can also be against a fixed difficulty chosen by the GM, or against an opposed roll from whoever the player is trying to convince. This has the advantage of working like everything else in an RPG. There's no special rules to learn, and while it will take some time to interface with the system, for a single roll, it really won't take that long. However, this method does have its issues. First off, as we'll see later on, the scope of what you can and can't do with persuasion is very poorly defined in most RPGs, leading to all manner of insults put against persuasion, from it being mind control to the age-old meme of the bard seducing the dragon. It can also be rather galling when, after an amazing moment of roleplay, you roll natural 1, and all of it goes to waste. Option number 3 is actually one of, if not the oldest options in any tabletop role-playing game, going all the way back to early Dungeons & Dragons in the mid to late 1970s. And that is the reaction roll. The GM rolls some dice, usually 2d6, possibly with a modifier, which is usually the player character's charisma modifier, and compares it to a chart. The higher the roll, the more enthusiastic, friendly, convinced, whatever it may be, the NPC happens to be. Proponents of this method say that it feels less like mind control, especially because the locus of control is in the person whose opinion is being decided, rather than the person trying to influence the opinion. Of all of these options, it also has the second smallest mechanical footprint. The GM quietly rolling dice by themselves without having to interact with the player, calling for things from them, does allow this mechanic to be used without interrupting the flow of play really at all if you're efficient enough as a GM. The big issue here is player agency, and more specifically that it doesn't really allow for any. Players can passively influence these rolls by setting their character's stats as high or low as they want, but at the end of the day, whether you succeed or fail will not come down to rolls from your own hands, it'll be from somebody else's. It also still has the age-old issue of you roleplay well and then the dice come up bad. That doesn't go away just because somebody else is rolling. The final option is what's often referred to as social combat, and this is where some sort of extended resolution system that is usually similar if not the same as the combat rules is used to decide the outcome of social encounters. Although early incarnations of this date all the way back to Lace and Steel in the 1980s, it's something that became very popular in the early 2000s in the indie scene, and that started to be picked up by mainstream RPGs in the 2010s. It has the nice benefit of not having everything come down to a single die roll, and if performed correctly, then it should feel like a conversation. It is, however, the most mechanical, and again, it does not deal with the age-old complaint of outcomes not matching roleplay. But speaking of rolling dice for social encounters, when should you roll them? On some level, almost everyone uses that option one from earlier of just roleplay it, at least some of the time, and only use mechanics for particularly important things. But what is or isn't particularly important? As far as I'm concerned, the first rule to consider here is that if an NPC would have no objection whatsoever to a request, then it should not require a roll. If you ask an NPC to pass the salt, they should probably just pass it to you. This is a principle that almost everyone can get behind. But this next one is more contentious. If a request is so wildly inappropriate that an NPC would never say yes to it, then I for one would never let the PCs roll for it. This is an attempt on my part to A. limit and clarify the scope of what persuasion rolls can do, thus B. forcing the players to actually think more about what they're requesting, and thus make things more sensible and realistic feeling. But for some people who subscribe to the say yes or roll philosophy of tabletop RPGs, it will be seen as an affront to player agency because, well, it is. But outlandish requests aren't the only things that I will push the no button for. If a player just says, "Can I persuade him?" without giving any sort of roleplay, I will stonewall them for as long as it takes until they give me at least a summary of what they are requesting, how they are making the request, what arguments, tactics, yada yadas they happen to be using, and then, and only then, will I give them a difficulty and let them roll. One complaint about having persuasion skills and abilities on a character sheet that some groups have is that players will sometimes try to just click their persuade button, say, "I persuade him," "I deceive her," without ever role-playing. And if the GM lets them get away with it, then this will kill immersion and atmosphere at the table. And the people who say this are correct. And that is why I, for one, am very, very stubborn about making my players roleplay, no matter how much effort it takes me. But roleplay not leading to a roll isn't always a sign of a stubborn GM. Some GMs, including me in my early GM career, would let a player auto-succeed on a roll if they give particularly good roleplay. It's seen as a way to reward players for high effort and high skill, and also to prevent the strange outcome where you give this amazing, perfect speech or witty remark or other thing, and then roll absolute crap with your dice and end up failing miserably. This can feel genuinely dissonant and frustrating, but it's something that I've come to accept. First off, as far as I'm concerned, no player should ever feel entitled to succeed on an action because of some roleplay they gave. Second, this unfairly advantages high charisma players over high charisma characters, which can lead to some awkward situations where a smooth-talking player with a mid-statted character can completely outpace a character whose player is a bit more awkward and reserved, but whose character on paper should have maxed out charisma stats. And finally, the reason I did this is to lend a sense of realism. Sometimes you say just the right thing, but you say it to the wrong person, and it falls flat anyway. Sometimes you say what you imagine will be the perfect thing, but it turns out that you're completely full of yourself and had no idea what you were doing the whole time. There are all manner of situations, in social encounters, where your perception of your success and your actual level of success can be different. And if you want to maintain a sense of realism and immersion at the table, then you need to acknowledge the possibility that these things might happen. And so, given these above 4 rules, which some people use, some people don't, my advice for when to roll would be this. If it is ever in doubt whether an NPC would say yes or no, that is when you roll. Then, and only then. But once you have rolled, the contentiousness of persuasion mechanics in RPGs don't end there. How much effect does a successful persuasion check have? A lot of people who don't like these sorts of mechanics in RPGs call them mind control, and they don't not have a point. On some level, what's effectively happening is that an NPC who is unwilling to do a task overhears a few magic words from a PC who wants them to do that task, and now suddenly they want to do it. Not only that, they feel rather compelled to do it, because if they do anything other than what the player asked from that successful persuasion check, well, that's a fundamental violation around what's supposed to happen after a successful roll. If you successfully persuade the elderly scholar to travel with you to the dungeon, and they decide to leave halfway through, well, that's your persuade check undermined. And that sucks. But personally, I think the issue is a bit more complicated than that. Ultimately, how much persuasion feels like mind control will really come down to the limits and scope of what the system and the GM define persuasion as being able to do. If persuasion can make an NPC do something that they would never ever do otherwise, and do it with a big, cheesy, enthusiastic grin on their faces, then yes, it absolutely is mind control. On the other hand, if persuasion rolls can't be used in situations that are completely beyond the bounds of what the NPC would plausibly do, or if its effect on the NPC's attitude is in some way limited, well, then it's a lot less like mind control. Perhaps after that successful persuasion check from earlier to ask that aged scholar to come with you, they do agree. They will travel with you to the dungeon, but they are really unenthusiastic about it. And the only reason they said yes is because, really, at the back of their mind, part of them was genuinely curious about what historical artifacts might be found there. They had some reason to say yes, they just hadn't been all the way to a yes when you made that roll. By putting some level of contextualization or limitation on what the persuasion roll is actually doing, the roll starts to feel less like mind control and more like influence. And that is an important distinction for having a degree of verisimilitude at the table. It's also worth noting that some RPGs do have more nuanced persuasion mechanics than just success is persuasion, fail is non-persuasion. I've only ever played one session of a Year Zero system game from Free League Publishing, that being a one-shot of Alien that I ran a couple of years ago, and that I would honestly rather forget. But in their RPGs, when someone succeeds on a manipulation check against you, because that's what they call the persuasion skill, you have a choice. You can comply, you can attack the person who persuaded you, or you can ask them to meet you in the middle and propose a bargain. By introducing a degree of choice and agency into the decision being made by the persuaded character, it largely negates the mind control factor that often gets leveled at persuasion rolls, and in a much less ham-fisted way than my hard limitations on the scope of persuasion. And that sort of mechanic has a huge impact on whether GMs will use persuasion against PCs, or whether those GMs will let PCs use persuasion against each other. Most GMs, myself included, won't usually have NPCs roll social skills against PCs. If I'm running, say, Cyberpunk Red, which has very vague persuasion rules, I'm probably not going to have an NPC roll persuasion against a PC to make them do something. I just won't. I will sometimes have them roll a face down, because if a PC loses a face down, they actually do have a choice of either comply or take a -2 against the NPC until you defeat them at something, but I usually won't use the persuasion skill against them, or the conversational interrogation skills for that matter. Cyberpunk Red has a lot of skills, but that's beside the point. The reason that so many GMs are afraid of doing this sort of thing is because compelling player behavior on the basis of somebody else's role is seen as a violation of player agency. Now, interestingly, this sort of logic is usually only used for social interactions, and not for, say, rolling for fear, insanity, suppressive fire, or any number of abilities that actually do compel the way players act. For instance, in Cyberpunk Red, if you fail your concentration versus auto-fire check against someone who is doing suppressive fire on you, congratulations! You now have to use your turn to move into cover. No ifs, no ands, no buts. You have to move towards the nearest piece of cover. If there is no piece of cover within your normal move range, you have to use your action to double move. If there is no piece of cover within your double move range, then you have to move as far as you can towards the nearest piece of cover. And that is your turn. No quibbling with the GM, you failed your roll. For the most part, this logic is seen as fine for high-stress emotional situations, like bullets spraying everywhere or encountering eldritch horrors. But for some reason, when an NPC asks you to pass the salt and you don't want to, it's seen as a bit beyond the pale. I am not really going to pass much judgment here, but if you'd like to in the comments, then go ahead. Now, some groups will actually allow persuasion rolls against players, but make the rolls at least partially non-binding, if not completely non-binding. And also, some players are actually fine with having their players' actions be decided by a die roll. In my first ever campaign, running Curse of Strahd, which to be fair was also a campaign with extensive use of PvP combat, I was pretty fine with players rolling deception checks against each other, and my players were pretty fine with honouring the results of those deception checks. If, say, one player character wanted to keep a secret from another, that was how we did it, and everybody was okay. The players honoured the rolls, we never had any issues with it. And indeed, some systems, like Burning Wheel, actually require you to do this. In Burning Wheel, if two characters have a disagreement over something, that disagreement must be resolved with a die roll. Having the two players responsible for those characters come to their own agreement out of character is seen as metagaming, and is thus not accepted. But this is admittedly an unusual game philosophy. But while a lot of discourse around persuasion checks revolves around what happens when they succeed, there are just as many issues around what happens when they fail. On some level, failing a skill check in most RPGs just means whatever you're trying to do doesn't happen. You're trying to climb the wall, but you failed, so you don't climb the wall. But some GMs handle things a bit differently. And a good analogy for this is that climbing a wall. Some GMs, when you fail to climb a wall, will have you fall down the wall and take damage. And likewise, some GMs, when you fail to convince an NPC, will have that NPC become hostile towards you. Now, on some level, there is a degree of verisimilitude to this. If you really roll badly on a roll, or if you keep rolling badly over several rolls, then yes, of course, eventually you will irritate the person you're trying to convince to the point of hostility. And yes, this could always result in combat. But having a single failed persuasion check result in combat is way too dicey, which is why personally I usually wait for my players to roll at least 2 or 3 fails in a row before I call for rolling initiative. In most social situations, even when you screw up once or twice, most people actually do give you a degree of grace. And as a GM, you should be trying to reflect that. There's also the question of escalation. Yes, failure to persuade someone can result in violence, but not always. In fact, rarely ever. I'm gonna be honest here. It's been about 10 years since I've been in any sort of fight, and that last one was one that happened on a school playground in my teens. It basically doesn't count. Most of the time, when people consistently fail to persuade someone, that person just leaves. And so, again, as GMs, always consider the non-combat implications of failing persuasion rolls. The next thing I'd like to touch on is social combat. It's not something that I have a ton of experience with, but I have tried it here and there. Some tabletop RPGs, especially the more recent ones, especially those with a more narrativist design philosophy, have combat-like extended rules for social interactions. They will have some sort of order of operations for when characters speak. They will have roles, they will have some variation of hit points that the characters use for the encounter, and they will have roles to reduce those hit points using various social skills. Mechanics like these can be seen in RPGs from Burning Wheel, Torchbearer, The Witcher, and many others. Some other RPGs have less combative social encounter rules, like say the council system in the One Ring RPG 2nd edition, but I haven't tried this personally, so I can't really speak to how it works, but it's basically just a glorified extended test from what I can tell. These mechanics have the benefit of resembling a conversation, at least within the bounds of what is often a constrained speaking order, and so this can make the actual social mechanics feel more natural. With something like a single persuasion roll or a GM reaction roll, it can be unclear on when the player has to roll. Do they have to roll for each point or argument they make? Do they have to roll at the end of the encounter? Do they roll at the start of the encounter? With social combat, it's a lot clearer. However, one thing that's often less clear is the social hit points that a lot of these systems have to use. When I was first introduced to the concept of social combat, it was by the GM who would end up running over the edge for me for the first time. We were all standing in the lobby of one of the university campus's buildings as we tried to figure out what room we were meant to be in, and we were all just chatting about various RPG systems and how they worked. And him being much more experienced with RPGs than all of us at the time, he pointed out that Fate had mental hit points for being persuaded. And all of us were really confused by this concept, which, to be fair, Fate having confusing mechanics is nothing new, but it's also kind of beside the point. Although the mechanics of social combat can be slotted naturally into a conversation, there is nothing natural about those mechanics. The idea of using persuasion to wear down your opponent's mental hit points is a really weird, unnatural way of thinking of things, and it puts an aggressive, combative framing in situations that maybe shouldn't have that. And even once you wade through all of that, these mechanics don't do much for the limitation and scope of persuasion. We still have that problem from earlier, and so we can still end up in the situation of persuasion as mind control. In fact, even systems that try to solve this issue can end up failing. Burning Wheel's Duel of Wits is a perfect example of this, although to be fair, it's actually the only one of Burning Wheel's 3 combat systems that I've never used, so I can't tell you too well how it works out in play, but I assume that it's similar to the conflict system in Torchbearer, which I have used for social conflict. Per the rules of Burning Wheel, when you win a Duel of Wits, you are not persuading your opponent. More often, you're persuading the audience around them, and in fact there's even a worked example of a dwarf and an elf arguing over politics that's used to prove this point. Whoever wins, the other one still retains all of their opinions on that political matter, but the rest of the court is swayed to one side or the other. However, Burning Wheel also says that you can use its mechanics for seduction. I am not the world's most seductive eyeball. Quite the opposite, in fact. However, it is my understanding that when you're trying to seduce someone, you are not trying to convince the people around your seduction target that they should sleep with you. You're trying to convince the person you're trying to seduce that they should sleep with you. Although perhaps Luke Crane is going for the Spice Girls philosophy here, that if you want to be my lover, you gotta get with my friends. Despite all this criticism, I don't dislike the concept of social combat. In fact, I think that some sort of extended persuasion resolution is actually a good idea for tabletop RPG mechanics. First off, if implemented well, it actually can be more natural, and it can be a lot more dramatic and cinematic than one die roll deciding the fate of everything that's going to happen. Especially since without good contextualization and limitation, a single failure of a persuasion roll can lead to disastrous consequences. There's also the added benefit that if you actually make social interaction important enough to need a chapter in your RPG's rulebook, players will think that social interaction is more important, and they will be more willing to use it. But to tie this video up in a lovely little bow, persuasion and social interaction in RPGs always has been a contentious issue, and to be honest, always will be a contentious issue. If you go back through the decades in RPG discourse, very little has actually changed. A lot of the same topics are still being argued, with the same sort of solutions still being suggested. At the end of the day, all you can do as a GM, as a player, as a game designer, is consider the option that works best for you, and go with that. I generally allow single skill checks with limited scopes for success and failure in situations where an NPC's decision would be uncertain. You may think I'm calling for too many rolls, you may think I'm calling for too few. Either way, do what you prefer. And above all else, make sure that your social interactions do feel natural, that NPCs are giving realistic reactions, and that nothing ever feels arbitrary or unfair to your players. As I said at the start, RPGs are a social hobby. And you need to make sure that the interactions that are happening within the game have a positive impact on the interactions that are happening outside of the game. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. How do you handle persuasion in your games? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.